Hey everybody, welcome back. I have another video for you. It has been a little while since I was able to record one. I had some traveling to do last week and other things coming up, but we are back. There is, as always, so much to discuss. Anything I don't get a chance to cover, go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/. Eric Draitzer. More stuff there to look at. Let's talk about a number of different issues today. I want to talk a little bit about Israel and Russia and how this is shaping into quite an interesting relationship against the backdrop of Russia's war in Ukraine. There's a number of things to discuss here, but the long story condensed into a very, very short one is basically that there are complicated interests at the root of the Israel Russia relationship, and that those interests really did bubble to the surface when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's one of the reasons why Israel was so hesitant to really condemn Russia as harshly as many other countries did when Russia invaded. This, of course, was a big, big issue in Israel and in the Jewish diaspora, and it has, I think, shaped some of the things that have happened since then. So let's discuss it. Specifically, I want to discuss it in context of some statements that were made just the other day by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. So the backstory here is that Lavrov is, as I think we all know, probably the most adept of all of Russia's, government officials at being able to articulate at least something approaching a cohesive narrative for the Kremlin's viewpoints. He's certainly the most articulate of those spokesmen. In any event, Lavrov was on Italian television giving a long interview. I believe it was something like 45 minutes to the broadcaster, in which he made a number of statements and a number of claims. And one of those had to do not so much with Israel specifically, but with Zelensky and with Jews. And specifically, the question was more or less about Russia's comments and Russia's position that it is denazifying Ukraine. And the counterpoint that the presenter raised, of course, about the issue of Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, being himself a Jew. And so Lavrov made a very interesting comment that I think needs to be unpacked a little bit, because I do think it gets to some of the nuances of what Russia is trying to do here. His point was basically, saying, well, the opponents of Russia say, what kind of Nazism can this be if Zelensky is the president of the country and he's a Jew? And Lavrov says, but excuse me, if I'm not mistaken, but wasn't Hitler also have, didn't Hitler also have Jewish blood? In other words, his point being that Jews themselves are actually the real anti Semites and historically have been. This is more or less what Lavrov said. I don't have the full quote in front of me. Maybe I'll bring it up before I finish recording so that I can get it down verbatim. But the point here is that Lavrov is essentially recalling a very, very tried and true anti Semitic trope, one that goes back all the way to the Tsar's secret police and the Okhrana and the creation of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, namely that Jews themselves are responsible for the oppression that Jews have encountered in Europe, that Jews are responsible for communism, Jews are responsible for capitalism, Jews are responsible for the Holocaust. In fact, this is one of the central sort of myths of fascist ideology, namely that Jews distort history and distort reality and distort facts in order to make themselves into victims, when in fact they are the ultimate perpetrators, right? This again goes, I already mentioned the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but it gets to a lot of the really deeply held anti-Semitic ideas in Europe. And you can see very clearly what Lavrov and the Russians are trying to do. They're trying to weaponize a lot of this lingering anti Semitism, this lingering hatred for Jews, and combine that, of course, with the very real, very prevalent, and very legitimate political positions of anti Zionism, of criticism of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, etc. In other words, trying to sort of create a combination in the minds of the listeners between Israel, the state, Jews, the people, and the Holocaust and Nazism. In other words, the idea being that Jews themselves are perfectly capable of being Nazis. Now, there is, of course, an element of truth to that, as there is in all propaganda. Israel has allied globally with far right formations all over the world. Israel has made its bed with many, including neo Nazis, in pursuit of its own sort of self-formulated national goals. Israel has promoted white supremacy, white nationalism, all of these things all over the world in recent years, again, in furtherance of their own political goals. And so the Russians are essentially trying to more or less whitewash history, as they've been throughout this conflict, in order to make the claim that Ukraine is a Nazi state, irrespective of the people of Ukraine having elected Zelensky by an overwhelming majority, irrespective of Ukraine having far less claims to being fascist than Russia at the moment, and irrespective of the fact that Azov Battalion represents a relatively small proportion of the overall power of the Ukrainian state. So, what Lavrov is essentially doing is trying to use history and weaponize history and certain aspects of history in order to spin a totally false narrative. And this then brings us to the second part of his quote, in which he basically again repeats a widely debunked lie that Hitler himself was Jewish or that Hitler had Jewish blood. Again, the primary, villain, the center focal point of the Holocaust and of our understanding of the Holocaust, for him to be Jewish then calls into question everything you understand about Nazism, about the Holocaust, and maybe, oh, I don't know, maybe the Kremlin is right. Maybe they have a point. Of course, Lavrov knows this is BS. This has been widely debunked. There were only a very, very small handful of tangential materials that suggested this, going back to Hitler's political opponents writing screeds about Hitler and his supposed fraternal grandmother being, I think, a house servant to a prominent Jewish family. And there were all these sort of stories, none of which have actually proven to be true. There was genetic testing that suggested maybe, a distant relative of Hitler shared some genetic traits that were Sephardic or Ashkenazi. I mean, these things then get sort of whitewashed into this very opaque narrative, which is, of course, politically useful, in which Jews are not victims. Hitler was a Jew. The Jews control the Holocaust story and the Holocaust myth, and they should not have a monopoly over the Holocaust and the creation of sort of Holocaust historiography. Again, mixing elements of truth, namely the misuse and abuse of the Holocaust in furtherance of apartheid in Israel and other aspects of the Zionist state, and also using it in furtherance of the Kremlin's current political goals. It seems so convoluted, and yet its internal logic does make a little bit of sense. As I said, this, of course, it recalls the anti-Semitic trope of the Jews themselves being responsible for the Holocaust. It shows how Russia is weaponizing anti-Semitism to galvanize support. In many parts of the world, especially in places like in the Middle East, these kinds of narratives still hold a tremendous amount of weight for reasons that we don't have time to go into, including in the inability to distinguish between anti-Zionist politics and anti-Semitic tropes, the inability to separate Israel as a contemporary political entity from the Holocaust as a discrete historical episode. There are many reasons why this has a lot of currency, but it does. And the Russians understand this, and the Russians are using this. How do you think this plays in places like the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia and in some of these other countries where Russia has a very clear strategic interest to pry those countries away from the United States and Israel and NATO and the West, broadly speaking? The Israeli foreign minister Yair Lapid has called the Russian ambassador to Israel in to, clarify those comments. Of course, there's nothing to clarify here. The Israelis know what the Russians are trying to accomplish here. The Russians are being fairly transparent in trying to do this kind of weaponization of history and of language. But all of this has a political context that has to be understood here. part of the reason why this situation has become so complicated vis-a-vis Israel, Russia, the United States, is because of the deep, deep connections between the Israeli state and elements in the United States, specifically Trump and Kushner and the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis. These relations, which were on full display while Trump was in the White House, they complicate this picture even more because while the Russians are in bed with Kushner and Trump and the Israelis, simultaneously the Israelis desperately need the Jewish diaspora, especially in the United States. And there are numerous articles that have been written. I can speak from my own personal experience. Every single Jewish person I know who is in the Jewish diaspora, that is to say, from the Soviet Union, from Ukraine, from places outside of the United States, including those people of my parents' generation, although my grandparents' generation has died out, their descendants and so forth, they are without, I can't think of even one exception, uh, supportive of Ukraine and opposing Russia and Putin, and almost exclusively condemned Israel for its refusal to condemn Russia, at least initially. It is what drove the Israelis to feel compelled to formally condemn the Russians. So we have a very complicated picture here where if you are viewing this conflict from the outside looking in, you can see that Israel is trying to walk this line here between not upsetting too deeply their very close ally in the Kremlin, including that ally with connections, to those criminal networks that operate in both Israel and Russia, the so-called Russian mafia, very powerful, very infamous as it's operating in Israel. Also, the illicit money flows, the money laundering, the energy money, all of the dirty lobbying money, all of these things, they are all in play here. And it complicates the nature of this relationship. But I think it should speak volumes, the fact that the Israelis have felt compelled to take a stronger stance against the Russians. My argument would be because they know that if they lose the older generation of the Jewish diaspora, Israel will be internationally isolated. Zelensky makes the claim publicly, says Israel must make a choice. Essentially, in his framing of it, must make a choice between Russia and Ukraine. But it's actually much more than that. When Zelensky says that Israel must make a choice, he's also saying that Israel has to make a choice between Russia and the Jewish diaspora, between its relations that are embedded institutionally in places like the United States and Ukraine and elsewhere. This is a complicated and I would say extremely unsettling position for the Israelis to find themselves in, but that is the nature of it. I think this is a big problem for Israel. And I think we're beginning to see that although they haven't wanted to, they are now essentially forced to come down against Russia. And that, of course, will have its own ramifications. I want to talk a little bit in the time I have remaining about Putin's great blunder here, Putin's great NATO blunder. If you listen to the Putin cheerleaders, apologists, bootlickers, whatever you want to call them, Putin is playing the long game here, challenging the West and NATO to what amounts to a global proxy war with Ukraine as only one theater of this conflict. If you listen to these depraved commentators, then that is, sort of the world that you're living in. But of course, the reality doesn't comport to that worldview where Putin is the grand master, the five-dimensional chess genius outplaying the rest of the world. I think we've seen Putin has blundered pretty much from the beginning of this conflict. And in fact, maybe one of the great blunders, maybe the greatest of all, has been with regard to NATO. So I'm, of course, here talking about the moves by both Finland and Sweden, which are more or less unofficially stating that they are headed directly into the camp of NATO and into NATO's membership. Now, I think we should recognize just how historic this transformation has been. As of January 2022, so just 4 months ago, the opinion polls in Finland showed support for NATO membership at roughly 21%. So, roughly 1 out of 5 in Finland back in January wanted to join NATO. As of a few weeks ago, that number, according to the most recent polls, that number stands at roughly 62%. So from roughly 21% to so from 20% to 60%. You can see that we're talking about three times the number of people in Finland now want to join NATO. Support for NATO membership tripling in a couple of months after decades and decades of being static. I think that tells us quite a lot about what the public view is of this conflict and of what Putin has created it, because I think it's very clear he has created this. Now, let's look at Sweden. Sweden, unlike Finland, was generally slightly warmer historically to joining NATO. As of January, it was roughly 30 to 35% in support of joining NATO, so roughly one out of three. Now it is roughly 60%. Again, a massive, massive increase. Not quite as big as that in Finland, but relatively comparable. So now both Sweden and Finland are headed for NATO membership thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine and, of course, everything that has happened since then. What do these countries offer to NATO? These are highly educated, highly advanced countries with highly advanced military capabilities. They both depend on their militaries. They both spend on their militaries. I believe both countries spend in excess of the required NATO threshold, that is to say, the threshold of GDP, of total military spending to national GDP. I believe it's like 2% or 3%, and both countries exceed that. Sweden in 2017 reintroduced military conscription thanks to Russia's invasion annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass. So you now have these countries in Scandinavia that have historically represented the epitome of military neutrality. Both of these countries headed into NATO thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. It just absolutely is dumbfounding to me that there are people who claim to be on the left, who claim to believe that Putin has somehow not made a complete disaster of Russia's strategic position vis-a-vis its neighbors to the west and to the north. So this is, I mean, really clear to me, and this is only going to get worse for Russia. Let's just talk very quickly about well, I will leave for the Patreon to talk a little bit about uranium and Russian nuclear capabilities, and I don't just mean military capabilities, but uranium, because the United States seeks to ban Russian uranium. There's a lot behind that, but we'll leave that for another time. I want to close up today talking a little bit about some of the technology that Ukraine has used. Specifically, there's two pieces of technology that deserve some attention. I've spent some time talking about the drones. This is a critically important issue. Turkish drones have really been center stage for Ukraine throughout this conflict. We're talking about the Bayraktar drones, which are considered, in the drone world, fairly advanced and really capable of carrying out, everything that they're designed for. They have shown repeatedly, the Ukrainians have shown repeatedly, that Turkish drones figure centrally in their ability to respond to Russia. I did a video about this, I guess now a week and a half ago, about some of these unexplained incidents that have taken place in Russia, the bombing of the fuel depot in Belgorod, the explosion at the chemical factory, the some of the unexplained fires, other things that have happened. Some of these are being directly tied to drone attacks carried out by the Ukrainians. Again, this connects to the larger international scene. Turkey and Erdogan has used Ukraine as essentially a vehicle for expanding their own influence around the Black Sea and internationally with their drone sales. Turkish drones and other weapons and technology, but especially drones, have really become I would say one of the centerpieces globally for countries that are looking to win what we would call small scale wars. This was true in the Armenia Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno Karabakh in 2020. This is true in the war in Ethiopia between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government. This was true a couple years ago in Libya in the war between the opposing governments there, where Turkey sided with the government in Tripoli. We have seen it over and over again. The Turkish drones are a game changer, and they continue to be in this war. So every time we see one of these incidents, they are sometimes accidents, that's clear, sometimes a result of corruption, mismanagement, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that some of these incidents are clearly Ukrainian counterattacks carried out using drone technology, Turkish drones. The other piece of technology that has made its appearance, or two actually, that have made their appearance that should be paid attention to. One is Elon Musk's StarLink. StarLink to provide internet access in Ukraine, where the infrastructure, the cable lines themselves have been severed or destroyed because of bombing or acts of sabotage or cyber hacking. The use of these Starlink has been, well, critically important to keeping Ukraine online, and keeping Ukraine online keeps the information flowing. It is the reason we see the images of the bodies in Bucha. It is the reason we see the images on Telegram channels of Russian troop movements, etc. All of this continues because internet remains functional in most of Ukraine despite Russia's attempts to bring it down. The other one is Clearview AI facial recognition technology. Now, if you are a tech person, you already know Clearview AI is this infamous company that has been, basically had scandal after scandal for their technology, which is both implicitly racist and biased against people of color, but also an extremely worrying big brother like tool to be used by law enforcement for all kinds of nefarious things. And so Clearview AI has had a number of problems in the United States in rolling out this really, really sick and troubling technology that basically creates these vast databases using tens of millions, hundreds of millions of data points on basically every individual everywhere. But they are now being used by Ukraine's armed forces, who are using it to identify Russian soldiers who have been killed, identify those who claim to be defectors, identifying those who may have carried out war crimes, etc., for the purposes of sometimes contacting their families back in Russia, sometimes simply for making identifications on bodies, etc. This has been a major, major controversy in Ukraine, and I would say a deeply worrying development that the Ukrainians are using this, not because they don't have reasons domestically within the context of their own war that I couldn't really speak to, but more importantly, the implications globally for what the use of this technology could mean. Think about what Clearview AI's technology and similar technologies can do in places like Xinjiang, where the Chinese are using facial recognition for all sorts of nefarious, activities to basically, well, more or less intern Uyghurs who aren't willing to submit to the kind of ethnic cleansing that has been going on there, demographic replacement, and so forth. We've seen this in Russia. We've seen this, of course, all over the United States in many jurisdictions, including federally and at the local level. So this is really a worrying development, and the fact that the Ukrainians are using this, I think we should keep that in mind, because anything that is proven on the battlefield in Ukraine, you bet will be coming back here to the United States and to any dictatorship around the world. So that's that. All right. Got to leave it there. I'm already over 20 minutes. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitz. A lot more to talk about there. I will have to leave it there. Talk to you again next time.